Hello and welcome back. I'm attorney Andrew Bethel of Bethel Law, where we dive deep into estate planning, finances, real estate, and taxes. Today, we're following up on our previous discussion about land trusts and LLCs by addressing a specific question that many of you have asked. Should you put each of your real properties into separate trusts? This topic was originally going to be part of a general Q&A, but it deserves its own deep dive. So hit the like button, subscribe, share the video with someone you know who owns rental property, and let's jump in. Let's start with the basic question. Should you put each of your properties into their own trust? Generally speaking, the answer is no. For most people, putting multiple properties into multiple trusts only compounds the complexity of managing your estate without offering significant benefits. Typically, it's best to put all your properties into a single revocable living trust. This simplifies your life and makes it easier for your successor trustee to manage your estate after you pass away. Creating separate trusts for each property can introduce unnecessary complexity. So let's talk about why. First, increased administrative burden. Managing multiple trusts means multiple sets of paperwork, separate bank accounts, and more complex tax filings after your death. This administrative burden can be overwhelming and is time-consuming. Second, cost. Setting up and maintaining multiple trusts can be costly. You'll incur legal fees for each trust, potentially ongoing administration fees, and potentially higher tax preparation costs. And third, no added protection. Separate trusts do not provide additional asset protection compared to a single revocable living trust. In California, a revocable living trust does not offer liability protection. The trust is essentially an extension of yourself in terms of ownership and liability. Adding more trust does nothing for you here. Using a single revocable living trust for all your properties offers simplicity and efficiency. First is with a streamlined management. One trust means one set of documents, one bank account, and a straightforward management process for your successor trustee. Second, unified estate planning. A single trust allows you to consolidate your estate planning, making it easier to adjust distributions and manage your assets as a whole. Third, cost effectiveness. Setting up and maintaining one trust is a less expensive than managing multiple trust process, saving you money on legal and administrative fees. If you owned rental properties or multiple real estate investments, you might consider forming a business entity like an LLC instead of creating multiple trusts though. Let's discuss why. Starting with asset protection, an LLC can provide liability protection that a revocable living trust just can't. This shields your personal assets from the claims arising from your rental properties. Next, simplified ownership. An LLC can own multiple properties, simplifying management and providing a clear structure for ownership and operations. And finally, flexibility. LLCs offer flexibility in management and can be adapted to include partners or additional investors. Now, you may be wondering about land trusts, so let's briefly touch on those, starting with probate avoidance. Like a revocable living trust, a land trust can help avoid probate. However, it offers no liability protection here in California. Then, from a liability standpoint, land trusts are often less flexible than LLCs and may face issues with lenders and title insurance companies. LLCs will generally give you wide latitude with what you can do with the underlying property, while land trusts can often restrict what can be done with said property. Lenders and title companies are also not keen to work with land trusts, and from what I've heard from my contacts in the real estate industry, they just hate dealing with land trusts, and so there are often blanket denials of lending to a land trust or providing title insurance when doing transactions involving them. Essentially, none of them want to touch the land trust. Lastly, this leads us to the topic of a lot of people are interested in anonymity. While land trusts can offer some level of anonymity, it's challenging to maintain complete privacy, especially if you already own the property and your name's in the chain of title. This is a giant discussion and one I went into great detail in our last video on land trusts and LLCs, so again, I suggest watching that for more detail. In essence, it's hard to really be totally anonymous, especially if it's with real property you already own. Your name is in that permanent chain of title for the property. So if you already own the property, then it's generally too late. You can have some anonymity by having the structure in place before the time of purchase, but you'll need to have the capital up front to purchase new property outright rather than go to a lender. Or if you can find a lender, be prepared to pay more than what you otherwise would have in order to get that loan. Now let's talk some real-world examples. As always, these are from actual cases we've worked on, but I won't be revealing any identifying information. In one case, we had a client that came to us after having created multiple LLCs to hold each of their properties. Their first problem was that they went to an online company to create the entities, so they barely had anything and didn't even have an operating agreement. The next problem was that it was way more complexity than what they really needed or really even wanted. They were concerned about liability, but that concern was costing them $2,400 a year between the 3 LLCs being registered in California due to that yearly $800 due for each LLC. They took care of the properties, they had very good insurance to cover them, and they got tired very quickly with paying that extra fee associated with having all those LLCs, like the yearly dues I mentioned, tax returns in preparation, agent for service of process, and so on. So in that case, we got rid of 2 of the LLCs for them and consolidated the rental properties into 1 LLC, and they kept their primary residence in the revocable living trust, while ensuring their sole LLC was therefore held in trust, thus avoiding probate on their death and making the administrative overhead of running their real estate investing much simpler. Another example was where we had a couple come in and they had many rental properties. They had the money to create multiple entities to insulate the liability of each entity from each other, but they of course didn't want to spend more than they needed to and increase the administrative work unnecessarily. So in their case, we created 3 entities. One to hold some rental properties in, let's say, location A, 1 LLC to hold rental properties in location B, and 1 LLC to hold the rental properties also in location B, but in which their children lived. We created some reasonable separation between the properties in the different locations, but we also further separated the properties wherein each of their children lived. The intent was to insulate the potential liability for the locations where the kids lived away from the other rental properties where essentially strangers lived. In the first case, we decreased the complexity of our client's estate to make things easier and less expensive, while in the second case, we increased the complexity of mom and dad's estate, but with the overall goal of taking advantage of some of the, well, advantages that complexity can have. Yes, each of these examples were with LLCs, but we've had many cases where clients come in with multiple trusts. Some out of date, some are empty, and some clients with properties spread across the multiple trusts. And in almost every case, we reduced their complexity by revoking useless trusts and consolidating assets, thus making everyone's lives easier. In most cases, using a single revocable living trust is sufficient for managing multiple properties. If you have more complex needs or require asset protection, then consider forming an LLC. Avoid falling into the trap of creating unnecessary complexity, which can be costly and burdensome. To sum up, putting each property into separate trusts is generally not necessary and can create more problems than it solves. Stick with a single revocable living trust for simplicity and consider an LLC for asset protection if you own rental properties. But what do you think? Am I overemphasizing simplicity, or do you agree with my approach that less is more? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video with your fellow real estate investors. I'm attorney Andrew Bethel, and I'll see you at our next meeting.